So welcome to the second half of module 3, which is on the justification debates. And the justification debates actually is kind of a two-sequence discussion, because we have what we call the new perspectives on Paul, and from that, the justification debates actually grow out of that movement. And we have today major discussions on new theories of justification. So, and those new theories are actually really helpful. But this is probably, I don't want to say the hardest conceptually. I think Christology is the hardest conceptual material that we have in our course, but it is the most complex with the most moving parts. So in that sense, it'll be quite a challenge for us, but we can do it, to kind of cover two major movements. The new perspectives, to preface this, probably began really in the early 80s, although it begins with the publication by E.P. Sanders called Paul, Palestine, and Judaism. And that was kind of in the late 70s, mid 70s. But really in the 80s, the debate that book sparked took off. And it's around the early 2000s where the new perspective discussion or debate starts to die off. And in the wake of its fading in the early 2000s, we have what we call the justification debates. And so we're still in the middle of it. And I think it's really exciting, because I think past models that find its roots all the way to the Protestant Reformation are important theologically. But I think pastorally, we need to think about the ways to present what salvation is, the gospel, to a different era and a new generation of people outside the church, and in ways that really speak to them. And I think some of the new theories address those needs. So we're going to trace, actually, when you think about it, a 40, 50 plus year history. And we're going to try to do it all in one night. As people are now joining in, I think this is our group for this evening, a couple of friendly reminders. So on Thursday, the next quiz goes up. I'm going to be working on grading quiz 2, tomorrow morning. As soon as the video's coded and uploaded, then I'll do the quizzes. So likely you'll have your quizzes graded, quiz 2, in time for quiz 3, which opens up Thursday morning and extends to Friday evening. So remember that our regular quiz time has been extended to Friday. So it's available on Thursday mornings and available on Friday, to give people who listen to the recordings on Wednesday time to study and get ready. So that's coming up. Also, after that, we have a reading week. And I just want to stress that it's not fall break, it's a fall reading week. So if you're undergrad, you might think, oh, fall break, I'll take a vacation. But in a reading week for graduate students, it's not in lieu of class. So we suspend class for that week. You might take another class. So some of you might actually be doing the Mosaic Journey course. If you are, let me know, because you might need a little bit more time with the historical Paul assignment, and I'm willing to do that. So communicate with me. But if you're not doing the Mosaic Journey course, that's an intensive all next week. You have not the week off, but a leisurely week where you'll be watching a documentary called The Polite Bride, and then you'll be walking through a questionnaire, 6 questions, for which you give paragraph essay style full sentences, no bullet points, no outlines. I want full paragraph discussions. And you go through the questionnaire. And so I made it a questionnaire, not a paper, because to kind of take the edge off the assignment. I do want it to be an exploratory, fun, detective work, puzzle solving type of project, where you're presented with a particular view of who the historical Paul is. And I think you'll want to challenge it. I think the view that is presented isn't the most accurate, nor is it the most, I think, pastorally beneficial portrait of Paul. And so the whole exercise is about, how do we reconstruct historical events? And does that affect the way we do theology, or think theologically about the message of the New Testament? The answer is yes. If you do the history wrong, you're going to come out with the wrong theology, and therefore the wrong pastoral applications. And so this is what the exercise is about. So I'll give a little bit more But I think what I'll do is this. I wanted to do a watch party, but I'm getting the feeling that it might be just simply easier that people watch the documentary on their own. It's free and available online. You can watch it through the Brandel Library website. So it's a movie that Brandel Library owns, and you can watch it through your North Park ID. So you log in, you check it out, you watch the video. It's a streaming service. So that all the links are in the syllabus, and the links are also on Canvas. So you watch the video, but before you watch the video, please, I can't emphasize enough, look at the blog post where I give a really, in my opinion, an introduction to the video so you don't get confused while you watch it. If you read the blog post, which is not that long, but it kind of introduces the major players who are interviewed, kind of the top minds on Paul in New Testament studies that are going to be interviewed in a flurry, and they represent a wide theological range. As you do that, then that blog post will really kind of set you up well to know what to look for when you watch the video. And you might also want to glance through the questionnaire, which is in your syllabus, and look at the questions first, so you know how to take notes as you watch the video. And then I'm going to probably do this. I'll do some sort of follow-up, either by email announcement on Canvas, or maybe I'll pull up a short video, but I'll just kind of give a short talk a little bit as an afterword, assuming that you watch the video, and then I'll talk a little bit after that. You can watch that, but the goal is to do the questionnaire. And so the next time we meet, we will spend some time in class discussing the Historical Paul project, because it ties in really well with the module on patronage and how the Greco-Roman world was run, and how the church was supposed to be a counter ecclesia. And the word ecclesia, the translated church in the New Testament, in secular terms means a political assembly of some sort. It's an alternative society to the Greco-Roman world, where patronage is not supposed to be practiced within the church. Although out there they did it, in the church, we're supposed to relate to one another differently. And so it spills really well into that. So the Historical Paul project, I hope, is going to be really fun. You'll laugh. Feel free to laugh when you watch some of the segments, because some of the ideas of Paul seem quite ridiculous. And then we're going to unpack a lot of that in class. But I'll kind of create a mini short follow-up lecture. I might draw from a video that I made previously and kind of do a cut and paste style, and then I'll post it up online. So that's your reading week: watching a movie, going to the Paul questionnaire, giving good essay style paragraph answers to the questions, using the resources online to answer some of these questions. And then we'll have a chance to discuss this material prior to the due date when the questionnaire is supposed to be submitted. So that's what's coming up. So while we're at it, are there any quick questions about what's happening during the reading week and the Historical Paul assignment? So I wanted to do a watch party, but I think logistically it's not going to work out. So I think I'm just going to depend on everyone to watch it individually through the Brandel Library.
For this project,
yes.
Can all the resources that we need for referencing be accessed online as well? Or do we need to be able to get into like a seminary library somewhere?
Yeah, so great question. So I created a folder on Google Drive, and I'll send the link to everyone. And I've done half the work for you. Technically, you don't have to do any extra work other than look up maybe the Dictionary of Paul and his letters with Scott McKnight, because his article on the Jerusalem collection is there. But I did some of the work for you. So I put together, and then you might want to find your own resources. So if what you like what you see in the Google Drive folder that I send, use those. And with that, that's more than adequate to do the assignment. But you're going to have to use the Brandel Library online resources for commentaries, because I can't steal commentaries or copyright it. So you have to check them out. There's a Brandel over the years has expanded its online resources, and commentaries are one of the first things that they've done. So you'll be able to find really good commentaries on that you can reference when you look up the Jerusalem collection in the individual passages. So Jerusalem collection is mentioned in 1 Corinthians, Romans, and some other texts. You look up the commentary on those letters and you'll find some discussion on the Jerusalem collection. So there's a little bit, everything is available online, either through the Google Drive that I provide, where you have individual essays, chapter scans, and also journal articles, which there's some fantastic ones. And then the books are going to be found online through the Brandel reserves, and you'll look up a couple commentaries. And so even though so all the resources are available for you without having to physically go to a theological library nearby and do the assignment. You can do it all at home by using, as long as your online connection gets you into Brandel, and also through the Google Drive link that I'll send. So thanks for that question, Rachel. So I try to make the assignment it's not easy, but it's easier, because you're not going to waste you're not going to do all the time of hunting things down. You can begin with the resources and go from there. Although there is something a little bit lost when you're not finding the resources yourselves. I think the exercise of researching is an important skill set, but I'm not going to burden the class with that during the reading week as much. Any other questions? All right.
Max,
yeah,
Max,
yes.
Folks are asking about when the questionnaire should be submitted. It says on the syllabus October 29th. Is that when you would like the questionnaire submitted?
Yeah. So that's a week after the reading week. So you do the reading week to do a rough draft. When we meet on Tuesday, if there's any questions you might have, you can ask them, and we'll discuss it and then you can review what you've done and polish it up for a Friday submission. I think that's a good schedule. Does that work? So whatever's on the syllabus, let's follow that. Okay, I'm looking at the chat. Yeah, October 29th. Okay, good. Is there a limit to checking out the electronic commentaries? No. I mean, you can check them out for a certain number of days, and multiple people can do it at the same time. You won't be able to download it. I mean, you quote unquote check them out and you read them to Adobe, and it marks that you've checked it out for 5 days, 7 days, whatever length you can. And then as soon as your expiration hits, you can't open up the document electronically anymore. You have to recheck it out. Like, I mean, you literally think of it as checking out stuff. You check it out stuff for a certain number of days, and your access to it during those days.
Max, I have a comment on the electronic checkout piece, because I made a horrible mistake last year.
Okay, sure.
And so you don't actually have to check them out even. You can just read them online. Yeah, because they ran into issues where there were too many folks trying, and I was one of them, to check them out. And so if anyone needs help with that, just let me know. I have my master's in library science, and I made I made a grave error too, so that was fun. But I can help you not do that.
Okay, so thank you. Yeah, I mean, actually, so reading online is free. So I think it's if you want to download it and be offline, that's when you have to check it out. So thank you for that clarification, Tom. But reading online is free. So if you have an iPad, it's really easy. You just read it online and use it whatever the electronic book is. It'll read like an ebook. Okay, good. Then if we're okay, I would like to begin, but let's begin with a short word of prayer. Heavenly Father and gracious God, we thank you for seeing us through almost the halfway point in the semester. We thank you, Father, that for all that we've learned so far. We thank you for those who are presenting this evening. We pray that you might especially empower the groups who present on the new perspective, justification. At stake is how we present the gospel, how we share the good news of your salvation to a world that seems to be even more broken and more hurting than it ever was before. So pastorally and theologically and intellectually, Lord, help us to grasp what we hear. and give us the wisdom to be able to share what we learned for the edification of your church, for the furtherment of the kingdom of God, and for your glory. This we pray in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Let's begin then with, I'm going to give a very short intro before I pass the baton over to our first presenters. The new perspective, so we're talking about the new perspective, and it's actually new perspectives. What we're going to get today are the highlights, the major players. There's no way we can cover all 50 plus people who've contributed to the debate. But we wanted to talk about, to a certain degree, is the importance of the debate, and also the history of how it kind of unfolded and who the major players were. So what we're going to do today is we're not going to cover everyone, because some people who participated in New Perspective gave a wild theory, and that wild theory died with their scholarship, and no one paid attention to it. It's really the ones whose ideas have enduring effect that we're going to be watching or kind of doing a survey of for our time together. So I want to quote Se-Yoon Kim, who's not a New Perspective proponent. He is, you can call him I don't want to say old perspective. I think no one is old perspective unless your scholarship was fundamentally before the 1980s and it ended there. What we have is a post-New Perspective. In other words, people might still argue for a traditional reading of Paul that has the Protestant Reformation in view, but nevertheless, the New Perspective has changed the way they articulate Paul's understanding of salvation, and to call it the old perspective is simply not accurate. It's better to call it the post-New Perspective. So, and that leads us to what we call the justification debates, new theories on what justification is and how to describe it. But at the time in which New Perspective was launched, and so this is the 90s, where it's had a chance to grow and exert its influence. Se-Yoon Kim wrote a book called Paul and the New Perspective as a response to the movement, and he has this comment. Since the Reformation, I think no school of thought, not even the Boltzmannian school, has exerted a greater influence upon Pauline scholarship than the school of the New Perspective. And this is actually a great, very long sentence, single sentence summary of the entire movement, and we're going to have to unpack the sentence with its radical reinterpretation of Paul's gospel, especially its doctrine of justification, on the basis of E.P. Sanders' definition of Second Temple Judaism covenantal nomism. The New Perspective, in many respects, is overturning the Reformational interpretation of Paul. That one sentence this is like how one describes 50 scholars in a kind of a 40-year debate in one sentence. I couldn't do it, but he does it right there. That we're going to pack every line of this in our time together. The potential significance of the school for the whole Christian faith can hardly be exaggerated, because the impact of New Perspective is it challenged the church to rethink the way it describes salvation. And that is directly tied into our mission and into how we participate in the expansion of God's kingdom. So I'm going to stop here with E.P. Sanders, because E.P. Sanders is going to be introduced by our presenting group, but I'll get back to him. But I did want to talk about how it all began. And this is where you're reading an Oropesa, McKnight, and Doss come in, and we're going to have a presentation on that soon. But I did want to talk about what I would call the grandfather, not the father, of the New Perspective. If E.P. Sanders really started it all with his book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, he did have a predecessor in Crystal Stendhal. Crystal Stendhal gave us a paper that was later published as an essay to the Society Novum Testamentum, which is kind of an elite, I don't want to say elitist, I'm going to say elite. It's not a pejorative term, but the top minds of Europe, what we call SNTS, meet every year. And Crystal Stendhal gave this amazing opening paper back in 1963 about Paul, the introspective conscience of the West. And he argued that there's a lot about the Protestant Reformation that got Paul wrong. And he thought that, for example, that Luther misunderstood Paul, that Luther misread into Paul his own introspective conscience, that Paul didn't have an introspective conscience or conscience that felt guilty. We recall that Luther, as a Roman Catholic Augustinian monk, never felt that he measured up to what is described in the Latin Vulgate as Justitia Dei, the justice of God. Now, we would translate that in Greek as Dikaiosyne Theou, or the righteousness of God. But the Vulgate, interestingly enough, translates the righteousness of God, that theme in Romans, the book of Romans, as Justitia Dei in Latin, which is the justice of God. And Luther thought the justice of God was oppressive and scary. He was frightened by it. Who could measure up to the justice of God? We're all sinners. And so, and then when he found that the word righteousness of God in Greek can also be translated as the righteousness that comes from God, not the justice that he demands from sinners as much as the gift of being in relationship with him, the righteousness from God that comes through Jesus Christ. When he retranslated the Greek, not as according to the Vulgate's Justitia Dei, but as the righteousness that comes from God, when he opened up his Greek New Testament, that's the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. It was his reading of Romans 1:17 and the whole letter that launched the 95 Theses, among other things, and launched what we call the Protestant Reformation. And what Crystal Stendhal says that Luther, there's many things of the Protestant Reformation that got Paul right, but there are a couple of things that they got wrong. And one of the things that Luther got wrong was that he read his guilty conscience into Paul. Paul didn't have introspective conscience. He didn't feel guilty about persecuting the church. He felt perfectly fine living life under the Torah. Read his autobiographical marks. He was bragging. I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law of Pharisee, as to zeal, persecuted the church. I was excelling among all my contemporaries, says Paul in Philippians. And he was, let me put it this way. Paul was what every mother hoped they could get their daughter to marry back in that day. He was well educated, an expert in the Torah, and probably one of the equivalent to the top university mind among the synagogues and the way they trained and schooled young boys and young women to obey the word, obey the Torah, or obey the law of God. So Paul, by virtue of his reading of the Torah, thought that the Jesus movement was a heretical group, and he hunted them down. And he had until the Damascus Road, he had no sense of problem. He thought it was perfectly okay. So with that, Stendhal opened a can of worms. This article took off, and people thought that, Paul doesn't have an introspective conscience. What Crystal Stendhal says is that Paul had a robust conscience. He didn't feel guilty at all for persecuting the church. He thought it was the right thing to do. And if the Protestant Reformation and Luther got this wrong of Paul, what also did they get wrong? That's the question. And that's going to lead us, and this E.P. Sanders' work, and where he argues that one of the things that Paul got wrong was his understanding of Judaism. He described Judaism wrongly. Not so much Paul. Sorry, let me take that back. Paul understood Judaism rightly. We as biblical interpreters have misunderstood Paul's critique of Judaism. So if Crystal Stendhal said that we misattribute to Paul an introspective conscience when he really had a robust one, E.P. Sanders is going to introduce the idea that what Paul does critique his Second Temple Jewish contemporaries, but we got that critique wrong. It's not the legalistic system that Protestant reformers make it out to be. And so E.P. Sanders offers an alternative thesis. And with that, I am going to stop the slideshow, and we're going to hear about the new perspective and its history from Tone, Natalie, and Bobby Joe, who are going to bring us up to speed to the justification debates. And it's in our break afterward with the second group that will actually be talking about some of the new theories of justification that were born from the debates. Excuse me. I don't know why I'm getting a little bit hoarse. That'll give me a perfect opportunity to pass the baton and then get rid of the frog in my throat. Okay. Pass. All right. And this is not, you can share. Great. Perfect. Thank you very much. And let me mute myself.
Perfect. All right. Well, Max had a nice little softball there for us to hit out. So like he alluded to, there's a lot of content in these articles. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. This Oropeza and McKnight article, it seeks to give a history of interpretation of the new perspective, which has deeply influenced Pauline studies in recent history. They lay out these common tenets that are shared by new perspective scholars later on in their article. They say that they have a sensitivity towards the Christian perception of Judaism. They define Second Temple Judaism as perceived not in legalistic terms, but by grace, election, and covenantal nomism. So this idea of covenantal nomism, their definition is laid out there. I would like to summarize it in a sense that like Jews' place in God's world is defined by God's covenant with them, which was the Mosaic law. The law was how God's people related with God, and it was through the law that Israel was saved. Another shared tenet would be that the pre-Damascus Paul had problems with pride and privilege rather than guilt and sin. That's the Stendhal kind of foundation, right? That they were reading too far into what Paul was saying Judaism was. They also say that the social dimensions of Paul's missions to the Gentiles is featured. Skipped a slide. There we go. The last few, Paul rejects the distinctive Jewish practices for his Gentile churches and for righteousness, faith, love, and obedience. The new perspective highlights righteousness related to participation in Christ. And I bolded this last one, naming that interpretations in the new perspective are rooted in biblical and ancient historical examination rather than traditional and theological dogmas and interpreting Paul. That feels like biblical and New Testament theology to me versus systematic theology. And that's a major tenet of our class here. So like you said, three major players is kind of who McKnight and Oropeza lay out. Sanders is the one who provides a major foundation for the new perspective. This is his major work. He is the one with the idea of covenantal nomism. He believes that faith in Christ is the only way to salvation. Paul's negativity towards the Torah isn't a legalistic matter with Judaism, but rather that it's simply not Christianity. And he uses the language of to righteous versus to justify. And I like that the language of to righteous kind of recenters the person, which feels important to the church. Our next person is James Dunn. He says that Paul maintains a sense of continuity with his Jewishness. He believes that works of the law center on the boundary markers related to Jewish pride and exclusivism. That becomes the center stage for Paul's conversations because of the Gentile mission and the Jews and that whole conflict there. And then our third major player is N.T. Wright. He uses this term of national righteousness, which is the social dimension at work and what Paul has issue with Judaism. And then the righteousness for the Jews is ethnic status based on their possession, rather than moral status based on performance of the law. So he would say that Israel's call was to be the light of the world, but instead of fulfilling this role, they use their vocation as an exclusive privilege. And these three, there's lots of other players at work, but these three kind of lay the foundation, and then we read some of the other articles and the rest of our reading for today.
Some of the strengths and weaknesses is that the authors clearly summarize some of the main points of Sanders, Dunn, and Wright. I think that the authors do a really good job of kind of summarizing what each of them view as the new perspective or new perspectives. And then they also do a really good job of laying out what is the new perspective and some of the arguments and kind of defining it. And I think that was super helpful. And the authors also lay out several challenges that come with the views, as well as some of the benefits in the view, which I found to be super helpful as well. But some of the weaknesses is, like Natalie mentioned, Dunn brings up that Paul maintains a sense of continuity with his Jewishness, which I don't know what that means, and I wish he would have been able to dive into that more and explain what that means, because it kind of suggests that Paul continues to observe Jewish practices. So I wish he would have explained that more. I also don't believe the authors really brought in a ton of their own thought, which I think would have been helpful or maybe strengthened this article. It kind of just felt like they went through everyone else's view and that was it. And then some of the pastoral implications. Some of these people are some key New Testament scholars, so I think it's important to understand some of their work as well as what they say about the new perspective on Paul. And even if you walk away and you're like, I absolutely hate the new perspective on Paul, then it strengthened and helped you understand your own way more. Or you might have liked it and been like, this is what I agree with. And so I think it's important for us to know this as pastors or ministers so that we know what we're teaching people about justification, grace, and etc.
Thank you both so much. And so I had the privilege of tackling the traditional Protestant perspective on Paul, as did the rest of my group. And just a full disclosure that if you were a little confused by this article, that just means it's working. Andrew Doss, what I love about him is that he is very self-aware that this is a very large undertaking to talk about the traditional Protestant perspective on Paul. And so he does a little dance within the article about the newer perspective, but also this traditional reading. So we'll dive in right away. And on page 83, right off the top, he gives us 3 interrelated claims of traditional Protestant readings of Paul. The first being Second Temple Jews adhered to a religion of works righteousness and legalism. Of course, he acknowledges that that's not completely accurate, but that is something that's sort of part of the baseline here when we look at the interrelated claims that have typically been around. And then Paul in response emphasizes God's free grace over against human works and the emphasis on that sheer grace. And you'll see that word come up a lot with Doss, that grace exclusive of works is characteristic of God's saving, justifying activity. And briefly, I do want to mention that the paradigm shift that Natalie sort of discussed with all these authors and theologians, right, is something that Doss recognizes as well. And he sort of summarizes it well here. It says, Paul's contrast of the works of the law with faith in Christ was a component of his argument for the inclusion of the Gentiles into God's people, a new perspective on Paul. And so he talks about that. But then he goes back to, okay, this is how we've traditionally viewed this, right? And so he says very clearly, I am representing for this volume the traditional view, and that includes the claim that Paul was responding to a legalistic or works-based perspective on the part of his Jewish peers. And he does this in several different ways to sort of help home in on our understanding of this. He uses Abraham, or he talks about Abraham as a model of obedience in Second Temple Judaism and Paul's approach to Galatians. So Abraham served as a prominent figure in Second Temple Jewish discourse as a model for conversion against paganism. His obedience was just praised in early theological writings. And so Abraham was someone that folks really got behind, which isn't a surprise when we look at the Bible canonically, right? But Paul highlights in Galatians 3 that it's not just Abraham and his obedience, right? It's his believing trust in God. Doss uses that phraseology a lot, his believing trust in God. And he uses Genesis and does a lot of really great work with the Greek to support that. And then Paul ultimately focuses, if you can go back, on Jesus as the seed. He bypasses Isaac and emphasizes that this believing trust is part of that basis for enjoying a blessing with Abraham. Next slide. And so the next thing that he does talk about is that Doss talks about is the perfect obedience and works of the law. He says on page 93 that Christ's spirit, not the law, counteracts the flesh. There's nothing that we could do or obey. There's no amount of work we could do. It's the spirit of Jesus, right, in us that saves us, correct? And then he talks about too how as God's elect people, and he uses a phrase elective nomism, that we're defined by our oneness in Christ, not necessarily by a Jewish or Gentile identity. And then Paul, he doesn't fault his Galatian rivals. So this is kind of Doss giving a throwback to this newer perspective, right? He's saying that Paul's not actually shaming this sort of like legalism that we talk about, right? He's faulting them for requiring the law itself, and not focusing and putting all their eggs in the Jesus basket, as it were. Next slide. And so another way in which Doss views that traditional Protestant perspective of Paul is through Romans 4:4-5. And that's a huge support for the traditional reading. Romans 4:4-5, it provides a supporting argument for the inclusion of Gentiles in God's salvation, and an argument that was necessary given that Second Temple Judaism emphasis on Abraham, right, that we'd sort of talked about, and his works. And so this newer perspective neatly resolves that stalemate of, okay, so what is it? It gives, that newer perspective gives a positive appraisal of Second Temple Judaism, and then recognizes Paul's intense concern with the inclusion of Gentiles in God's salvation. And that's compatible with the readings of Galatians 3 and Romans 4 that we brought up today. And then this sort of hints at the gift of justification, which our peers are probably going to talk about a lot more. I'll just read the quote here from Doss. Consonant with the more traditional understanding of Paul and the law, a contrast between human effort and divine activity is characteristic of Paul's approach to justification and righteousness. So not what we do, but it's Jesus.
Some of the strengths and weaknesses is Doss's article isn't just academic. Doss has some personal stories and personal experiences tied in, and it also clearly lays out and summarizes some of the traditional perspectives on Paul, which is helpful. But like Tone already said, Doss does seem to bounce around a lot, include a lot, go back and forth between the new perspective and traditional perspectives. So it was kind of hard to follow at some points, kind of feeling like Doss needs to stay in one lane. And then some of the pastoral implications is Doss really emphasizes the grace in that our obedience and faithfulness is rooted within Christ, and Christ is the center of everything. So that was really great and something that we often need to teach. And then also Doss also emphasizes that in the Protestant interpretation of Paul, everything stems from his Christology, which is extremely important. And then one thing Tone really reminded me from this article, and also to include in this slide, is that learning Greek is helpful so that we can understand what these words meant to some of the original audience and people who were speaking Greek, and also gives us better insight into how we can interpret some of the words in some of the text as well.
And the biggest thing we want to walk away with, besides everything we just tried to sum up as well as we could, is to adapt a pastoral posture of humility and grace, because this is a lot of content. I know I'm still confused by it and looking forward to learning more, but this is just, again, there's these paradigms that are shifting that Max was alluding to. It's exciting work that maybe some of us get to be a part of, right? In our studies, or maybe we go on to be scholars. And so we need humility and grace when we're looking at hundreds and thousands of years of history, and trying to piece this all together, but then remembering, again, really kind of like Doss alluded to, like it's all about grace anyway. So just lean into that. There you go.
Thank you very much. You zipped through it, but I think you did a great job in summarizing the movement and highlighting some of the key players. I think though, as a class, we need to digest this a little bit. So I'm going to do this exercise, and then hopefully, I'm going to break it up so that there's a different, the presenters aren't in the same group. But what I want to do is, two simple questions. Before you even read any of this or heard of any of this new perspective, what was your view of Judaism? How did you understand Judaism through the lens of the New Testament? What have you been taught about Judaism? I think all of us have ascribed to Judaism a form of legalism. And I personally think that the great legacy of the new perspective is we should jettison the word legalism. We shouldn't describe, you can talk about more, I think we have to be more precise with our language. It might have been a meritorious theology, but when we think of legalism in a Western mindset, isn't what Judaism was doing. And I think that's one of the things that the new perspective exposed. So what we should talk about is, what was your view of Judaism? What's your view of the Pharisees? How have you been kind of understanding who they are and what makes them tick? And then how has what you read changed your view? Maybe it didn't, but maybe it forced some of us to re-articulate what we believed before in more precise ways. It might have changed our view on a certain number of things, but I want us to describe how our understanding of Judaism has changed because of what we read in the articles or whatever. And then also, if you have time, whatever questions you might have that I can actually boomerang back to the group when we come back. So I'm going to go ahead and do our breakout rooms. So please talk about what your views of Judaism were prior to today and what you read. And then did it help? Did the article change your mind? Did you discover something new about Judaism you never discovered before by the articles that you read? So let's see, we had 20 people. So 6, let's try that. That means everyone has a 3 or 4. Okay, let me see here. Okay, Tone is okay, good. Brandy, good. Bobby, Joe, good. Oh, sorry, Brandy's with the other group. Let me see. Let's see, Natalie, where are you, Natalie? Are you separate from everyone else? You are, okay, perfect. So I'll visit, but each of our presenting team is in a different group. So that's perfect. And 10 minutes. All right. So Chanel, are you able to show video? Because I'm not quite sure where you're at. So you might not be good where you're at, but it'd be okay, good. Okay. So I mean, I don't want to lead the discussion. Maybe Bobby Joe, you want to take the reins, but I certainly would love to first hear what people say and then kind of join in here or there before I go to another group.
So what was everyone's view? Let's take the first.
Yeah, so what did you think of Judaism? What do you think, if someone were to describe what Judaism was, I mean, prior to reading the articles, how would you have responded to them?
And definitely as a kid, I was taught it was all about legalism, and like law was all about following rules, and that rules were never gonna be able to find salvation. It was just gonna make you frustrated, and really realizing the problem was kind of the way it had been presented before.
Okay, how about you, Chanel?
So my thought process of this was similar to just following the Torah, and then that God is that he was ultimately one, and that's what the concern was with mankind, is just making sure that that was understood. If that even makes sense.
Okay. I mean, I again, I seem to be leading, but I don't want to lead the discussion. So, Bobby Joe, what was your view of Judaism before you did the research on this presentation?
I don't know if I had a strong view or a ton of thoughts because I didn't grow up in the church. So I didn't grow up with a ton of like, what did you learn in, children's church or growing up in youth groups? I didn't really have any of that influence until I got to college and went to a Christian university. But I think, like everyone else said, the only thing I really heard was like, follow the rules. There's all these rules to follow. But that was really it.
Okay. And how did the article change things, or at least, spur some thoughts about Judaism that you never realized before or thought about?
I would say first, I think the articles gave me more knowledge, but also more questions and confusion.
Okay.
I think they were so jam-packed with stuff that it was hard to keep everything straight. Like I should have been mapping this out. Like this is what this person believed. This is where this went. Because there was so much stuff in these articles that I was like, oh, gotta map this out. So it felt helpful to read them, but I also think it gave me more questions than answers.
A little bit of fire hose of information coming at you.
Okay.
I never really thought about grace being any part of this had always been presented that grace was brand new with Christianity, and there was no room for grace in Second Temple Judaism at all. And so I did pick that up in somewhere in the reading, this kind of concept of election being connected with grace, and that was new to me. I was like, oh, I hadn't thought about that potentially being a connection. They did talk about how that made it complicated, but it had always been the simple way of being this is brand new. There was nothing else like this prior to.
I mean, that's exactly what E.P. Sander was trying to say, that he doesn't, while the Paul's contemporaries, the Jewish contemporaries of his day, use the word election. They don't use the word grace. Nevertheless, what they describe as a grace-based system, that you're in by God's grace or election. God chose you. There's nothing meritorious about God's choosing. And the Torah was a way for you to express that you're part of this elected people of God. Now, how do you know what a Jew is? Well, they observe the kosher food laws. They get circumcised. They won't steal when everyone else is stealing. They have they have these weird laws that talk about Sabbath and taking a rest when everyone is making an extra dollar. When on Sabbath, that's a prime time for commercial commerce, and everyone else is making more money than you. These Jews worship God. What is this group? So the whole point is that Sanders is saying that they're not doing that in order to earn salvation. They're saying that this is what salvation looks like. We're already saved. That's why we're doing these things. So the big problem then becomes, if Judaism in Paul's day was grace-based, and you obey the law not to earn your salvation, but because you're already saved, you're already God's elect people, then why did Paul have a problem with Judaism? It sounds like Christianity. That's what got everyone going on. Well, maybe Paul didn't have a problem with Judaism as legalism, because Judaism wasn't legalism. He faulted Judaism for something else. And we should really just kind of rethink what we understand about Paul's understanding of salvation, because if Paul articulates salvation using Judaism as a foil for it, and we change the foil, then what about Paul's view of salvation might change with that, because they're connected. So this is what Sanders kind of contributed. This is the kind of the big picture idea so I think one thing we can really think about is that if Judaism is grace, then how would that change the way you present, you view the Pharisees, view the different Jewish characters, what does Paul find problematic about the law? So that's where James Dunn and Tom Wright and some other people. So I'm going to pull back. I'm going to look to another group. But if Judaism is not legalism, but then what is Paul critiquing about Judaism? Because so far it sounds like Christianity. It looks really good. That's what James Dunn, Tom Wright, and some other folks in your article, in the essays that you're reading, have talked about. So what is it about the law that Paul found problematic? And I'm going to leave you to discuss that as I go to another group. But good. So I think this is probably the most shocking thing that Sanders claims, that Judaism is not just not legalism, it's a grace-based system. So Paul shouldn't have any problem with it. All right, let me join this other group.
That is,
Oh,
and that, Amy, that's something like we didn't even have time to unpack, and it's because I think it is a both and that's sort of what Doss alluded to as well, that it is like Judaism, yes, religion of grace. And I think we see that when, like, I think of Bruckner's class, of course, because he's amazing. And so there's certainly that sense of grace from the get-go. And so I think that's just part of God's overarching way, right? And so of course it's there, and
there rules and laws that we need to follow to retain it. I think that I can't remember who it was that said that you retain.
And then I think of the binding and loosing piece too. I think that and that is another thing we wanted to bring up, didn't have time to, but like that sort of fits in as well to this conversation, I think.
Sounds good. I mean, I just left another group, but they were discussing how the most shocking thing about what they read was that Judaism apparently is not legalism, it's a grace-based system. And so what I would draw out from that is why would Paul have any problem with Judaism? And that's why the New Perspective was launched. Well, so if Judaism really is a grace-based, or we call it an election-based system, they don't use the word grace, they use the word election. You're in because God chose you, and not because of anything you did. That's where the grace comes in. God chose you and cut a covenant with you, and you obey the law, not to earn your salvation. It shows that I'm God's people. I'm already saved. So don't Christians do that? We obey God not because to earn our salvation, but because we're already saved. We love God and we want to follow Him. And then, so if that's what Judaism is in Paul's day, Paul should have no problem with it. And so, what is it about Judaism that he was critiquing? And that's where you get like James Dunn and some other people coming along trying to answer that question, and you get a new perspective on Paul's critique of the law, because the old idea from the Reformation doesn't seem to make sense of what we know about Judaism in Paul's day. So that's kind of what kind of unfolding. So great. I'm going to call the groups back because I think we already overspent our 10 minutes, but I just wanted to at least visit one more. And we'll kind of unpack this a little bit more as we go. So thank you. All right, let me, how do I, okay, here I go. Okay, I'm gonna leave the room. Okay, all right. Oh wait, no, I don't want to leave the Zoom room. I want to, okay, I'm gonna close the rooms. Okay, we're all gonna leave.
There you go.
Okay, there you go. Okay, do we have everyone? I think we have everyone. Okay. Great. So I wanted to kind of open this up for discussion. So the two groups I was able to visit, I was able to hear some really good dialogue about. So I think the most surprising thing about Sanders' article is his claim that Judaism was a grace-based system. And that should have shocked everyone. Really, I grew up all my life thinking it's legalistic, and Sanders comes out and says, no, look at the evidence. There's plenty of passages in Tosefta, the Mishnah, Midrash commentaries on the Old Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Targums, which is the Aramaic translations of the Old Testament. All these Jewish resources, he catalogs hundreds of them. Out of a 700-page book, 500 is just primary source reading on Judaism. All examples, 500 pages, where the emphasis is not on Torah obedience, but on the fact that you're elected. You're God's people because God chose you. And that's what grace is. Nothing of my own merit, but God simply chose me. That's why I'm in salvation. And therefore, as part of God's people, I'm going to obey the law, not to earn my salvation, because I'm already saved. I'm already elected. Doesn't that sound like Christianity? So why would Paul have any problem with it? That's the whole beginning point of the new perspective, that Paul shouldn't have had any problem with Judaism because it looks so much like Christianity, a grace-based system. Therefore, what was Paul's critique of the law? Why did Paul find the law problematic? So, and that kind of law, and then you have a new perspective on what Paul thinks is wrong with the law, and and from that, how does Paul understand salvation? So, so this is kind of how the whole thing began, and this is a 40-year journey. So what I want to do is just kind of get some responses from the groups. What does your group share? And maybe I can draw in maybe some of our original presenters to kind of respond to some of the comments as they unfold. But I don't, for some reason, oh, good, okay. I thought I lost the list of breakout room people, but I didn't. It's here. So Drew, Kathleen, Laura, and Rachel, what did your group talk about?
We didn't discuss who is going to talk. Go ahead, Rachel. You got it, girl.
Oh, well, we agreed that it was to read the new perspective really challenged our maybe preconceptions about Judaism, and that we tend as people to want it to be black and white and really clear, one is all about rules and one is about grace, and it's really not that black and white. And then one spot that we spent quite a bit of time discussing, and maybe the group can give clarity, is we weren't really tracking. We appreciated what was written about Abraham as held up as a model of obedience, but then also this highlight of belief and faith. But we weren't sure which part of that was traditional, which part was new, or if it was all traditional or all new. We just got a little bit lost in that part of the DOS article. So if you have clarity on that, that'd be great.
Okay.
Max, am I able to?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, please.
That?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And Rachel, I don't know if I'll even give clarity. We all in our group read that article more than once. I took copious amounts of notes on that article because it's not to blame Das. He just has so much he has to work with, right? And so I'm sure his editor was like, I need this many pages, and go. And so I think, especially what we were trying to convey with Abraham, and Max, please correct me or other group members if I'm wrong, but Abraham was kind of like the boy, right? People were all about him. They praised his obedience. You can find that a lot of that of that praise in ancient texts of the time. And so what Paul is trying to do there is not, obviously, yay, he was obedient, but it wasn't him. It was about the work of God in him, right? It was because of his love, that relationship, that grace-filled relationship. And as Max even corrected in our group, our little mini session just a few minutes ago, Abraham was God's elect, right? And so he was one of his chosen people. And because of that and his obedience and trust, belief and trust and faith in God. That's what Paul wanted to highlight when he, in Galatians 3, he was doing some throwbacks to Genesis. And so, and then to ultimately lead us back to Paul's Christology, which is really the undercurrent there in Galatians and most of his writings, where it's about being the seed of Jesus, not the seed of Isaac or Abraham or whomever. Max, did that make any sense?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to answer your question, to add what Tone said, is that Doss actually has a whole book on this. So if I would love to sign the whole book, because I actually think it's an excellent book. It's called Paul and the Law, but that would make this class too hard for people. So I signed the chapter, not the whole book, on which he's summarizing a lot of things. One of the things that he talked about was that for sure Abraham was a key figure in Judaism, both for Christianity and for Paul's Jewish contemporaries. In Judaism, he's an example of faithful obedience. And that's the or faithfulness, which includes a subcomponent of obedience, but it's certainly not legalism. Abraham was faithful to the covenant. Even before 430 years later, Moses introduces the Torah. Well before that, Abraham is a model for how we respond to God. And this sets up a debate then for Paul and his Jewish contemporaries. Is Abraham, therefore, the proper response to God, is it faithful obedience, or is it faith, trusting God with everything? And there's an overlap. I don't necessarily think that you can make a hard distinction between faithful obedience and trusting God. I think one leads into the other, but they're not the same. And so there is this debate. How should we understand Abraham's life as one giant response to God, of which God's people, whether it's Judaism or Christianity, should emulate or imitate? And Paul's going to side on Abraham's absolute trust against all odds, that even at the age, in his hundreds and Sarah in her 90s, they would have a child, and that through that God would bless all nations through Abraham's seed, in which Paul gives a very big Christological reading that it's not seed descendants, but the descendant, Jesus Christ. He reads it as a singular. And that's in contrast to Jewish commentaries that think about Abraham as the perfect model of faithfulness or faithful obedience to God. So that's where Doss is. That's one of Doss's evidence, is that while election was emphasized, it was somehow tied to Torah obedience. And so Doss will try to articulate that past reformational readings are problematic. They're really, in many ways, sometimes they caricature Judaism, not characterize Judaism. And I think we do that too. It's kind of funny that in the 21st century, preaching and teaching in the churches still take a Protestant reformational model that is from the 16th century, and impute that into what Judaism was in the first century, and just kind of repeat it uncritically and unthinkingly, when we have so much more evidence and data on what Second Temple Judaism is like, that our description of it can be more refined, and with it, a better understanding of the gospel. So, I'm going to lecture mode. Sorry, I got really excited about the topic. So I think this, but you have to understand that Pauline studies was boring, and the New Perspective just blew up everything. And New Testament studies got so exciting because of New Perspective. So one benefit, just kind of anecdotally, is that when I was a doctoral student, everyone was like really excited about just re-examining Paul. That was, even if you didn't agree with New Perspective, it forced you to rethink the way we read Paul, and you either came out with a better argument for what you thought were right ways of viewing Paul, but the language is imprecise and it led to misunderstanding. So how can we better describe a Protestant Reformational reading of Paul with more precision? Or you took some of the things that the New Perspective had and broke away from a Protestant or certain Protestant forms of understanding of Paul. And I think for me personally, we'll get this in the second group. The imputation of Christ's righteousness I always found very problematic, and in the covenant circle, that's not really a big debate. But I think in wider Protestant evangelicalism, especially those in the Reformed camp, the imputation of Christ's righteousness is a big tenet of their understanding of justification, and I just don't think it's there. I think it's an empty straw man. I think there's better ways to describe the mechanism for how we are made right with God, and we don't have to talk about somehow Christ's perfect obedience being imputed upon the believer. So the idea that God doesn't see me, he sees Jesus, is the idea that I'm clothed with Christ's perfect righteousness, and I don't think that's true. Jesus' perfect righteousness is his own, has nothing to do with me. But by virtue of my union or relationship with Christ, I'm justified. But I don't think Christ's perfect righteousness is imputed. This is something that is discussed in detail for the next section with the next group. So I kind of went ahead, but there's a lot of good things in the new perspective. And before I go further, which is what I don't want to do, other groups, can I just hear really briefly what you talked about? So even if it's redundant, just tell me really quickly. Let's give it like a 1-minute report. So how about Allison, Amy, and Tone? Which I just heard from, but can you just like share a little bit of what you talked about? Okay, Tone says she's not going to speak. So who's going to do it? Okay, yeah, okay.
I was just going to say, Tone, I hope I don't repeat anything. We talked more about the context that we came out of.
Okay.
If the perspective of Judaism was incorporated into our faith community at all, and we all came from very different backgrounds. So I grew up in a secular home, so learning church lingo was something that was introduced to me when I was in high school. So I think the only thing I knew about like Judaism was that Jesus was a Jew. And then going to a university for my undergrad, that there was a professor who was very specific about like the Christian tradition is based off of Judaism and their practices. So like you have to interpret them together. But then also like in the articles that we had for today, understanding the fullness of that may not be complete because we're looking at Judaism through a Christian lens. So we're standing on different sides of the glass. So the fullness of what we understand from our side of the glass, like we need to kind of like bring that barrier down as much as we can to understand like where Paul is coming from.
Yeah, I think all of our churches operate on a 16th century view of Judaism as legalism. And let me just say this: the pastoral implications is if you make Judaism to be legalism and you make Jesus a legalism buster, you water down Christianity, because Christianity is so much more than that. And I don't think legalism is the greatest sin. There's so many worse sins that the church is in danger of repeating uncritically, because they sometimes reduce justification to just an anti-legalistic system, forensic system, which Christianity never was. So the new perspective has rightly critiqued the legalism language. It is really a poor character of Judaism. It doesn't do justice to Judaism. It doesn't do justice to Christianity. I personally think we have to jettison it, but we'll kind of continue that a little bit later. So how about Julie, Michelle, and Mike? I haven't heard from your group.
Mike, go for it.
We just shared briefly about how, well, personally, I grew up having a low view of Jewish legalism. Definitely thought that was the case, and Pharisees were people not like me. And then slowly in the last 5 to 10 years, I've been, before seminary, hearing some things that challenge, but certainly in seminary, and Michelle and both Julie also said that we've been really engaged with our understanding of what the law in Judaism was, and even what is the message of Paul. So they had a lot more to say, but that's my.
Great. And I hear echoes that any of you who took an Old Testament class, either with Nate Clayton or Jim Bruckner, would have known that there's something really beautiful about Old Testament faith, and that's preserved really well in continuity with Christianity. It's not just a sharp contrast. There is a contrast going on, but the continuity, I think, is more important than the contrast. So, okay, good. Christina, Mario, Michael.
Hi, we just talked about our experience. My opinion, my experience, I kind of thought Judaism was a more legalistic type of religion, just about what I know and what I knew about it. And Christina talked about some of her experience, her experience with her faith. And yeah, I did share with our group that maybe a couple of years ago, I did have a chance to attend a Jewish temple service. And it was like I thought it was really great. I mean, like the worship was really good. So I've come to like appreciate, some of the things that, that religion, what comes forth from that religion. So, but my experience has been more of like a legalistic opinion.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm hearing that. I think people have, I didn't want to characterize the group, but I think a lot of us grew up with, and I understand in Judaism as legalism, and then we've never heard of an alternative model. And without hearing an alternative model that's more accurate historically to the Judaism of Jesus' day, I think we are in danger of contextualizing the New Testament because it's born in Judaism wrongly. Because if we get the context wrong, then what do we get about how do we understand the New Testament's message wrong? So that's kind of the big interpretive or hermeneutical implications of the new perspective. And lastly, although I joined the group, Bobby, Joe, Chanel, and Aaron, can you briefly share what your group talked about? And then we're gonna go back to the PowerPoint. I'm gonna zip through the end and then we'll take our break a little bit late, but that'll be a nice division for the next presentation group.
We talked about that grace piece and that being a piece of Judaism that was kind of new to us. What else did we talk about? Oh, and just it seemed to be Paul's big issue with Judaism was that it wasn't Christianity. It wasn't that it was inherently flawed or something. It wasn't Christ.
Yeah, they didn't recognize Christ as the Messiah. I mean, that's one thing that Paul's Jewish contemporaries rejected, was Jesus' identity as Messiah of God. Otherwise, just as a soteriological system, it seemed to be quite okay, at least according to Sanders' point of view. Okay, great. I'm going to go back to share screen, and then we're going to walk through some highlights. So I don't want to repeat too much, but I want to go in some detail about what the New Perspective group is all about. So we did talk about E.P. Sanders, and let me kind of erase the screen here a little bit. So right here, his book came in 1977. So it began in the 80s, what I call the New Perspective. And Sanders said that one of the things that Protestant reformers did that was wrong was that imputed its critique of Roman Catholicism into Paul's critique of Judaism. So, and Roman Catholicism, at least that was practiced in the 16th century, was a works righteousness system. It was a meritorious system. You had things like indulgences, where you could buy time off of purgatory. And the good works kind of also reduced one's length of stay in this interim state called purgatory. So while Luther's Catholicism in the 16th century, and Luther had 95 theses of critiquing Catholicism in light of what he understood the New Testament was teaching. In light of those 95 theses, Catholicism looked like a works righteousness system. Luther read into Paul's Critique of Judaism also works righteousness system, but Judaism isn't works righteousness according to Sanders. When you look at it, it's a grace-based election system. So that's what we then, so this is the phrase that on page 543, this is Sanders' conclusion. So after 500 pages of reading about election and grace in Judaism, this is what Sanders says in his book. Salvation is by grace. Works are a condition of staying in, but they do not earn salvation. They signifies one elected status as God's people. Those are Sanders' exact words. So his whole point about covenantal nomonism is that you're in by election, but you stay in. You maintain salvation through obedience to the Torah. You don't. It's not to earn salvation. You already have it, but to stay within it, or to not lose your salvation, or not forsake your election. The issue of Torah obedience was important. I think that that's why he called it covenantal nomism, where you're in by covenant, and nomism was his word choice. It's not the most elegant word, but he didn't want to use legalism. He was really against the word legalism, so because he doesn't think of Judaism as a legalistic system. So he took the Greek word nomos, and he created his own word, nomism, lawism. So it's covenantal, not legalism, but covenantal lawism. We should understand the law as an expression of one's identity, not something you do to earn your salvation. So that's his whole point. And so Sanders is known famously for saying election to get in, and that's by grace, because that's what election is. God chooses you. And to stay in, it's lawism or Torah obedience, to maintain one's status as God's people. If Judaism is not works righteousness, but grace-based, and Paul knew it wasn't works righteousness, but grace-based, why would Paul have anything problematic against Judaism? And so that's where, as you heard our presenters, Sanders comes up with this very famous line, another one, that this is what Paul's finding wrong with Judaism, is not Christianity. In other words, he finds no problem with the soteriological system. It's just that Christ is nowhere in that system. Judaism didn't recognize Jesus as Israel's Messiah, and that's what's wrong with Judaism. But so let's put it this way: in a traditional Protestant view, there's the idea is that there's something wrong with Judaism or defective with Judaism. So if Jesus didn't come, both Jew and Gentile would be lost under the dominion of sin. Jesus came to deliver ransom Israel first, but nevertheless Israel had to be ransomed. The covenant was obliterated, and he expanded that invitation to include the Gentiles. So had Israel went his own way and Jesus never showed up, under a traditional Protestant view, then the whole world would be lost, whether you're Jew or Gentile. Under Sanders' system, there's nothing wrong with Judaism. So if Judaism, if Jesus didn't come, then Judaism could have kept going on its own way, and they would have been fine. They would still remain God's people. Judaism didn't need to be fixed. That's Sanders' viewpoint. Then we might ask is then what does Paul find wrong with Judaism? And he says it's not Christianity. In other words, the introduction of Jesus the Messiah is a double-edged sword. On one thing, it meant that those who rejected Jesus the Messiah are now outside of God's people. They're not God's true elect ones, because Paul makes it really clear that without Jesus as Lord and the Christ of Israel, that God has reconstituted God's people around that confession. So if you don't share that confession, you're out. So there's an irony here, but that confession also allows Gentiles to join in the group. So there is a turning point in history. Sanders doesn't say there's two tracks to salvation. He won't go there. He won't say that Judaism is one track and Christianity is another track. He will say there's only one track to salvation, and that's Jesus as the Messiah. But had Jesus not come, Judaism would not have to be changed. It was quite okay the way it was. That's Sanders' thesis. Where under traditional Protestant Christianity, both were lost under sin's dominion, and Jesus had to come because he hadn't come, both Jews and Gentiles would have been unredeemed anyway. So now what Sanders said was not very satisfactory. What do you mean that Judaism is not Christianity? That's the only thing that Paul wants. Paul must have had some critique of the law because he goes in such great lengths to critique it. But now what we're thinking is that, well, if the law doesn't earn my salvation, and it's not a legalistic system, then what is it about the law that Paul found problematic? And this is where Dunn comes in. Dunn says that, well, Paul doesn't find something soteriologically wrong with the law. He finds something sociologically wrong with the law. In other words, the law as it was practiced in Jesus' day shut out Gentiles. When Judaism was supposed to be a light to the Gentiles, they weren't. They practiced the Torah obedience in such a way that Gentile exclusion became inherent to their practice. And so Dunn's very famous for saying that that Paul's problem with Judaism was not that there was soteriological. There was some sort of salvation deficiency in it. Paul didn't find anything salvifically problematic with Judaism. What he did find wrong with it is sociological or ecclesiological. The way Judaism was practiced, it allowed for no Gentile inclusion at all, and that's why Jesus had to come. So the way he gets there exegetically is that he has a different understanding of what works of the law is. So this is the part that hopefully people picked up in their reading. Works of the law. So typically when we think of law, most of us think this way, that the primary function of the law is defining and constitutes sin. It also provides an atonement system by which sin can be forgiven. The guilt of one's sin transgression can be forgiven by the animal sacrificial system, and the law prevents a moral law. So you have a moral aspect of the law. It defines what sin is and what is not sin. It has an atonement system or the forgiveness of sins, so it's the right atonement. And then there's also what we call ceremonial laws that restrict Israel's contact with the Gentiles. That includes circumcision, Sabbath, the kosher food laws, the Jewish religious festivals. These are things that only Jews do, not Gentiles. And so normally, when we think of works of the law, we usually think it's the whole thing. All of this is the works of the law. That's how we've been trained. What Dunn says is that's wrong. The works of the law isn't all three. It's just number three. It's just the third one. It's just the ceremonial aspects of the law. He's limiting it to just the ceremonial aspects. That when he talks about works of the law, not the law, but we see the exact phrase works of the law that is restricted to only the ceremonial kind, only the circumcision, the food laws, the Jewish Sabbath festivals that serve as ethnic or social boundary markers for Israel at the exclusion of those who are not Hebrew or Israelite or Jewish. So listen to the way Dunn, for example, reads Galatians 2:15. It's different. Okay, so he says, he interprets, we ourselves are, Paul's saying, we are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is justified not by, and this is how you understand it. It says the works of the law. not by the works of the law, meaning the ethnic boundary markers of the law. There's not Jews shouldn't take any pride in their ethnic identity or their nationalistic identity. Everything that sets them apart ethnically and socially apart from Gentiles, we're not justified by that. We're instead justified through our faith in Jesus as the Messiah. So justification is not a salvation scheme for Paul. Dunn says it's an ecclesial scheme. What Paul's understanding of justification allows Gentiles into the people of God, whereas his Jewish contemporaries, the way they practiced the Torah, excluded Gentiles because they overemphasized Judaism's ethnic identity to the point where Gentiles can never join the people of God because they don't share that ethnic identity. That's Dunn's view in a nutshell. Now, there are a lot of problems with this. The big question is, every time you read works of the law, does it make sense to interpret that not as the whole thing, as we do it, including the moral code, but just the ceremonial part of it? And I think it has a lot of problems. That if we interpret works of the law as typically the ceremonial kind, it doesn't include the moral law, like stealing, do not kill, steal, or the moral demands the law places on us, I think we don't quite read Paul correctly. And that's one of the big critiques of Dunn. And one of his biggest critics. But let me go back. Doss is a big critic, but this idea works of the law really at the time in which it debuted seemed quite persuasive. A lot of people bought into it, so that's why Dunn is a major player. So one of the people that believe that not only accepted what Sanders said as Judaism, but also kind of accepted what Dunn said as well, was Tom Wright. So Tom Wright doesn't agree with everything Dunn says, but he did think that one of the key issues of Paul's critique of Judaism was his nationalistic tendencies. So what Tom Wright does, though, is he develops a much larger system for understanding what justification is. But let me just kind of put it in terms of a new perspective view. What he thinks is that when one of the things he argues is that salvation, when Paul says salvation comes to the Jew, he really means first and then the Gentile. He really means that historically. In other words, justification is not about salvation to Israel and Gentiles. Really, justification is about salvation of Israel. And once Israel its covenant gets renewed, then it launches the Gentile mission. Once Israel is in right relationship with God, a new covenant, a new constantly people of God, a renewed covenant can now go on mission and and Abraham's seed can be a blessing to all nations. So justification for Tom Wright in his theology is that Jesus needs to restore Israel's faithfulness first. And once their covenant is renewed because it's been broken, then Israel launch on a Gentile mission to include Gentiles. And so he has a view that justification is primarily for the Jew first, and then for the Gentile. But really, most of what Jesus is doing is reconstituting Israel. So I'll skip this screen. These are kind of the only thing I would say is that he believed that Second Temple Judaism. He did accept Sanders' view. He was convinced that Sanders was right. He's also convinced that Dunn's discussion of ethnic boundary markers was important, but he took it a different direction. And what he argues then is, this is a nice summary. Tom Wright has probably been the most prolific author on the New Perspective than any other person. And his theory is the most complex. And I would say this as a system. Remember, we talked about systematic theology versus biblical theology versus New Testament theology. If you look at Tom Wright's, the gospel according to Tom Wright, it is a consistent system throughout. It's coherent. It's a big picture view of what New Testament's about, and it makes sense. The big problem, though, is that like biblical theology, does the way Tom Wright read the individual passages, are they accurate? And when you put the pieces together, does the system hold without any tension? I think there's more tensions in Paul and Tom Wright's reading of the Pauline letters than Tom Wright is willing to admit. But I wanted to simply here talk about what Tom Wright says is the gospel according to Paul. So he thinks, so this is a summary, and I already summarized it for you, but he believes that God entered a covenant with Israel. He envisioned Israel to be the seed of Abraham that would be the light unto the Gentiles. So the original promise of Abraham's seed should have been all of Israel. They would be blessing to the nations, but Israel failed. In the same way Adam failed to obey in the garden, Israel failed to obey the Torah, and they delegitimized their role as a blessing to the Gentiles. And what Christ is, in many ways, is representative Israel. His understanding of Christology is that Christ does whatever all that Israel fails to do. And because Christ is the seed of Abraham, he basically fulfills the covenant in a way that Israel never could, and renews the covenant that was broken. To his death, even on the cross, Christ was Torah obedient to the very end. He obeyed the will of the Father. So he modeled for Israel what Israel could never do. And he kept the covenant of Abraham, even before the heart of the covenant that is further elaborated with Torah obedience, but nevertheless, the covenant is larger than Torah obedience. Jesus preserved the covenant and in fact renewed it. So if Christ is representative of Israel, I'm going to focus on this paragraph. He lifts the curse of the covenant against Israel, and by doing so, opens the way for the Gentile mission to begin. With faith replacing the ethnic markers of Israel, Israel's transformed into being not an ethnic people, but a world family. Those Jews who reject Christ are still under the curse of the covenant, but and they continue the medicine of being nationalistic. But for both Jew and Gentile alike, continuation of God's people for the Jew and a new entry to God's people for the Gentile, both require that you imitate Christ's faithfulness. So he has a particular way of understanding what faith is. He thinks it's faithfulness, not faith. And he thinks that since Christ was faithful and we did what Israel cannot, the way we get in the same covenant is to imitate Christ's faithfulness. And that's for both Jew and Gentile. And so I'll let you kind of read the slide on your own together. But Tom Wright's view of the history of Israel and what Christ's mission does to fulfill all Israel that cannot, allows him to say that justification is really about restoring Israel first. And then once you restore Israel as a secondary theme, as a corollary to the main theme of justification, under the umbrella of Israel's restoration, you get the mission to the Gentiles. So, so he defines righteousness of God as God's covenantal faithfulness to Israel. So, and that's what the righteousness of God is about, putting to right Israel first, and then through Israel's restoration, the people of God are launched out into the world, and they become a blessing to all nations, and then the Gentiles get to join the people of God too. The mission expands. So I'm going to stop there, and I kind of added a little bit more detail than our presenters, based on reading Dunn's book, Wright's essays, books, articles, like 1,000 pages of it or more. And I try to distill it and add a little bit more detail than what our presenters did. But I'm going to pause. Are there any questions? So what I'm trying to help you see is kind of how things unfold. First, you have Crystal Stendahl questioning Protestant readings of Paul. It places a seed of doubt. If Paul didn't have an introspective conscience, but a robust conscience, what else did we get wrong about Paul? Then you have E.P. Sanders saying, well, what we got wrong about Paul was his understanding of Judaism. We wrongly attribute to Paul that Paul thought Judaism was legalistic and that Paul's critique of Judaism was its legalism. That's not Paul at all. We got that from Luther. Luther thought rightly that 16th century, not 21st century, but 16th century Roman Catholicism was legalistic. And Luther read into Paul's critique of Judaism his own beef with Catholicism. So, but really when you look at how Jews describe themselves, it looks like an election-based system. It looks like you're in by election or grace and you stay in by Torah obedience. Why would Paul have a problem with that? Because don't Christians say that we're in by grace, but then I obey God, not to earn my salvation, but because I'm already saved? It seems like the same system. And then, so E.P. Sanders says that therefore, why would Paul have any problem with the law? It must be that it's just simply not Christianity, that Jews don't confess Jesus is the Messiah. And then no one liked that answer. So James Dunn said, no, let's not stop there. Let's look a little bit deeper. Let's say that Sanders is right. Judaism is covenantal nomism. Therefore, Paul should have a problem with Judaism, with at least as covenantal nomism. What does Paul have a problem with if it's not its soteriological covenantal nomistic system? It's sociology. The way Judaism practiced, it so emphasized its ethnic identity, it shut out the Gentiles. So really, Paul's understanding of the works of the law is not just the whole law, it's just those parts that make Israel exclusive and shut out Gentiles. No, some people like James Dunn's article, and then Tom Wright says, well, let's take that even further. I do believe that the ethnic boundaries of Israel are important, but not the same way Dunn thinks. I think what's going on is that justification has to do with the restoration of Israel first. First, let's justify Israel. And once the covenant is renewed, then it's a separate, it's a corollary doctrine, a sub-doctrine. It's an idea that is under the umbrella of justification. But the gospel doesn't go to the world first. The gospel goes to the Jew first. Once Israel's restored, then it's through Israel's renewed covenant and Israel being a light unto the Gentiles now are invited into the people of God. And that's his system. And this is just 3 people. There are 50 other people that take E.P. Sanders' view of Judaism, say it's right, and now they're trying to figure out what Paul finds wrong with the law and what Paul thinks salvation looks like. So what I want to say is that you don't have to know all 50. You have to know Stendahl, Sanders, Dunn, and Wright. And focus in on your reading. When Orpace and Scott McKnight and Doss talk about Dunn and Wright and Sanders, what they say. I gave you my best summary of what those views are and how they connect together. And know that the new perspectives disagree on what Paul's critique of the law is, but they are united by one idea, that Judaism as covenantal nomism is right. Sanders is right. So all the new perspective people disagree on what Paul finds wrong with the law, and also they have different views of justification. They have their own ideas, but they do agree on one thing, that Sanders is right. And that's what unites the movement. Now, so this is where I want people to, here's the punchline of it all. Can everyone please, if this is hard to follow up at this time, rewatch the video. You'll find that what I'm saying is semi, it's fairly accurate. I don't think I've traced the history wrongly, and I think I've added to what the presenters said. So you also have their presentation. But what I want to say is that we have to understand that the response to the new perspective is not just how they viewed Paul, but they asked the question, because this is what unites the movement: is Sanders right? And the response is yes and no. Sanders is partially right, but also his view of Judaism also has its problems. And so that leads us to, well, is the old better? I should have put that as a question. Oh, so add a question mark here. Is the old better? Question mark. Is the old better? Well, the answer is yes and no. And what we'll do then is take a break. Okay, so I'll pause here. How did I move off screen? So let me stop sharing. Okay, we're gonna take a break. I want to talk about how traditional Protestant Christianity has responded to new perspectives, view of Judaism. That's really what we have to talk about first before we get to Paul. Paul is actually covered in the second half with our presenters. Next presentation group. But really, did Sanders get it right? And the answer is not Sanders is all wrong, and the answer is not Sanders is all right. We have to de-thread what Sanders got right. Is Judaism legalism? No, it's not. Does it mean that there wasn't any merit-based component to Judaism? That's not right either. There is a merit-based component, but let's not call that legalism. Let's call it something else. And let's know where the merit is bared versus an uncritical caricature of Judaism as just a system of do's and don'ts, which it never was. So we're going to de-thread that, and we're going to come up with a different term called synergistic nomism that is unelegant and in many ways it's not going to catch on. But scholars have embraced synergistic nomism as an alternative to covenantal nomism. But I have an easy way to try to explain it to you. And I guarantee that the light bulbs will go on. Well, I won't guarantee it. I'm hoping the light bulbs will go on. Everyone will have just an epiphany and all come together. But that's going to happen after our break. So any quick questions before we go on break? Does everyone kind of understand that at least why Sanders, Dunn, and Wright are important, how they possibly spill into and connect with each other thematically, and that what unites the group is not their view on Paul, because they're all different. What unites the group, the new perspective, is that they all say that Sanders is correct. So unqualified, Judaism is an election-based system. Sanders' description of covenantal nomism, minus some details, is accurate, and that's what unites the movement. And the response to it is that we have to understand: is Sanders right about Judaism? And what you'll find that critically thinking scholarship has done, this is what we call a post-new perspective response, is that yes, he got some things right, but he also got some things wrong. And we're going to de-thread that. And from there, now we can look at justification freshly with Paul, and we get into the justification debate. Okay, I take it that people don't have a question, so they want to break. So I have literally at the quarter. So at 5 minutes past the hour, 20 minutes, 5 minutes past the hour. I'll see you then. Okay, I think hopefully everyone's back. If people log in a little bit later, do you think you need to move forward? So we're gonna zip in, and what's gonna probably happen is this. I'm gonna wrap up the new perspective. We're gonna have a presentation on justification theory, and I probably won't be able to finish commenting on the or wrapping up the new justification theories until the next time we're together. We'll be able to have the second presenters present and discuss their presentation, but we won't be able to move. I usually have a section that basically forms the tail end of the after we have a group discussion on something, and that's going to have to simply be pushed to the next time that we're together. It is a large module, so I think sometimes we make it, sometimes we don't. This time we're not going to quite make it, but we won't be too far behind. There's only just like a wrap up at the end left that will wait till our next time together. So let's talk about what is a post new perspective response. Is the old better? Yes and no. It's both. And what I want, and I'm going to try to put this in a nutshell. I've foreshadowed this response through our previous from last week's module on the apocalyptic Paul. So remember that Sanders thinks that Judaism is covenantal nomism. Now I'm going to make a separation here. So I think his understanding of covenantal nomism fits Old Testament faith really well, but there is a 400-year gap, approximately 400-year gap between the close of the Old Testament canon and the New Testament times. In other words, okay, so let me put this in perspective. We are not even 300 years old as a nation. We have not reached our tricentennial. In 2076, I don't think I'm going to live that long, but in 2076, if you're around, you get to celebrate America's 300th birthday. We're talking about a period that's 400 years, plus or minus, a few decades, a 400-year journey between the end of the Old Testament canon, the last prophet, Malachi, to the beginning of John the Baptist ministry. That's a 400-year gap. In order for Sanders' theory to work, he has to say that not only that Old Testament faith is covenantal nomism, but in this 400 years, Judaism remains unchanged theologically, that there's no major theological shifts in Judaism in that 400-year period. 400, that's a long time. Our country's not even 400 years old. So remember this picture? Remember what I described what Old Testament faith was? Remember this? This is from last week's module, that you're in the covenant by election. This is covenantal nomism. This is Old Testament faith. And if you obey the law, it leads to blessing. But if you disobey, don't worry, because if you repent, there's a sacrificial system that provides for the forgiveness of sins. The covenant gets renewed, and you're back on the blessings track. Remember that? But what did we say actually happened? In practice, this wasn't lived into. Israel showed through its history, especially the prophetic period, that not only does it disobey the covenant, but no matter how many times the prophet preaches a message of repentance, Israel remained unrepentant. And because they remained unrepentant, the sacrificial system became useless. There's no atonement for sin, and they fell under what we call the Deuteronomic curses. This is what happened in practice. So for Sanders' theory to work, Old Testament faith and Judaism in Jesus' day and everything in between has to look like this. And I don't think that's the case. I think in 400 years, you have an evolution in Jewish theology where the non-repentance of Israel and ultimately ending in the symbol of destruction of Israel's election, the temple. The temple was the public, visible symbol of Israel's election. What does it mean that God lets the temple be destroyed by the Babylonians? It means that you're out of the covenant. You've lost your election. You're no longer your apostasy has no longer made you my people anymore. There's that tension there. That's the image. And so what happens in Israel's history is that while in theory and its ideal, Old Testament faith looks like covenantal nomism, in practice, it didn't stay the same. That after the destruction of the temple, you have this tension. So if Israel, I'm going to use my my hand here, hopefully you can see me. If Israel, if covenantal nomism holds election at the center, and you just keep your election by Torah obedience, what the structure of the temple is there's a shift. It's not just election, because if we don't obey the Torah, you jeopardize the covenant and we might lose the land again. We might get another invasion like the Babylonians again. What does it mean that the Romans are occupying us? Are we really free under Roman occupation? When is God going to liberate us? All of a sudden, Torah obedience becomes far more important than it was originally designed in the Old Testament. That's what happens over 400 years. And so a scholar, a Finnish scholar, came up with the unelegant word. I saw in the chat people are making fun of it. That's fine. Go ahead and make fun of New Testament terms. We don't come with good names. It's fine. I think it's really funny. I love it. But synergistic nomism, it's a merit-based theology, but it's not legalism. The Jew didn't think that by obeying the law, I earned my salvation. They're saying that I have to obey the law so I don't lose my election again. That when God restored Israel at the return of the exile, and the temple was rebuilt, so the first temple Solomon is gone, and from Ezra and Nehemiah's time, you have a second temple, or the beginnings of second temple Judaism, because it's no longer the temple of Solomon that was destroyed, but the new temple that was rebuilt by Ezra and Nehemiah. You have a shift in Jewish theology, and over 400 years, Torah obedience became far more important than it ever was. It's not the original intention. And so Lato, who's a Finnish scholar, Timo Lato, he coined the term synergistic nomism, and like it or not, it stuck. And so the reason why we use synergistic nomism is we don't want to use the word legalism ever again. Scholars have jettisoned the term. What we have instead is a synergism, where election and Torah obedience are more closely tied than ever before. And so while Sanders rightly reads Old Testament election texts and demonstrates that grace was in the air, election was in the air of Second Temple Judaism, so was Torah obedience. So Das, in the book that was summarized by his chapter, but nevertheless he has a separate book on it, he comes up with a list of Second Temple Jewish texts that emphasize obedience to the law, not so much election. So the way he summarizes it is that if you look at the whole evidence, it's not one or the other, but both. Grace and Torah obedience are in tension with each other, or election, Torah obedience are in tension with each other. So he does think Second Temple Judaism is a works righteousness system or a merit theology, but not the caricature of legalism that we make it out today. It's works righteousness because we're working out our election in a way that we don't lose it by disobeying the law. It's not, we have election still. We're not trying to earn it. We're not trying to earn grace. We have it. We just don't want to forsake it by our disobedience. And there's a tension here. So God's forgiving grace and the strict demand of the law represent two opposing poles in Jewish thought that persisted in logical tension. That's what Judaism was. And it was Timo Lato that gave you the term synergistic nomism, that sin means with, or energistic, or is from the word ergon, means work. Works work alongside or with our election in order to give this tension that we call Second Temple Judaism. So here's an example of the text. I mean, this sounds to me like a merit-based theology. The pious Jew says, I'll do everything just as Yahweh has commanded me, because this very thing, obedience to the command, is righteousness before me, before the Lord. So you have election-based text, but you also have saying that what is righteousness before the Lord? It's the very thing of obeying God's law. So Qumran, I'll let you read this on your own. Qumran also has both election texts, and here they have works the law texts where law, it is the work that you do to obey the Torah, but not for salvation, so you don't lose your election. There's a difference. There's a nuance. And so I think what we have therefore is that we can't accept E.P. Sanders' view of covenantal nomism in its entirety. It's preserved in the fact that election is in fact a part of Israel's identity at the time of Jesus and Paul. But nevertheless, they thought you could lose it. You can lose it by your disobedience to Torah. You could break the covenant. And that makes election no longer the center, but now the center is shared. And you have this tension between Torah obedience and election. And Paul does critique humanity's ability to obey the Torah, to keep the covenant, because of what he experienced. He experienced sin more than transgression. He discovered on Damascus Road that he himself was blind to sin so much, he was persecuting the church and he thought he was doing righteousness. And so his account of Damascus Road, the apocalyptic experience, broke sin's grip on him. And he developed from that, not that from the experience, but that experience spurred him to relook at Israel's scriptures and Israel's history and he realized that sin can't just be transgression, it has to be a cosmic power as well. And if sin is a cosmic power, then the law is powerless to deal with it. So let me just put it this way. What does the law do? It's good, right? So it allows you to navigate through a broken and fallen world. And that's Israel's best. That's what God, that's why the law is a gift. It tells you what's morally right and morally wrong, how to worship God and live a life of human flourishing. So you obey the Torah in a broken, fallen world, but Jesus's death and resurrection as an apocalyptic event changes the world we live in. So that, because as long as the game, quote unquote, the game of life is Torah obedience in a broken, fallen world, the broken, fallen world will always trump Torah obedience. Sin is just too dominant in this world scenario for us to ever win against it. But if God changes the structure of reality so that sin no longer has its dominating effect, then the conditions and rules for life have changed under a new dominion or reign called grace. And so the law is good. It's just that all it can do is help you navigate a broken, fallen world. It can't change the world. The gospel changes the world, and that's why it's good news. And so, what I want to say is that, I need to wrap this up. So we're going to, is everything wrong? I mean, so did the New Perspective not also give us some good readings of Paul? It does. So I'm going to broach that not here, because Tom Wright's the one that introduces the idea that grace is a gift, but it's not free. And there's another scholar named John Barclay who takes that idea and blows it up. And his book is so helpful. It took a completely, I think that what it does is it does what Bonhoeffer always told us to do. Don't make grace cheap, it's costly. And with Barclay's book, you now have the exegetical basis for it. And that leads us to the chapter you read in Barclay, as well as alternative forms of justification through debate with Peter Leithart and what you're reading. So I'm going to stop here. And then I'm going to let our presenters present. We're not going to have, and then we'll try to have a little bit of Q&A, and then we'll just have to pick it up on the next time together. So our presenters, it's yours.
All right. So realizing that we have 2 seconds to present, We weren't sure if we were supposed to report out on Barclay's response to DOS, but I'm gonna share just like two things that I think are important from that, if that's okay, in our 2 seconds. All right. Oh, sorry. All right. So one thing that I think—
I'm sorry. Let me just say this. So I want you to present unrushed. And if people need to exit, that's okay. Just go ahead and exit if you go past our time, and you can listen to the recording. But as presenters, you get the time that you need. You don't have to feel the rush. And people can pick it up through the recording. All right. So let's do that.
Fair. All right. So one thing I think is incredibly important to point out from Barclay's response to DOS is that Barclay states that his argument is that Paul has perfected grace as an incongruous gift, given without regard to worth, and that he has reconceptualized God's grace by locating its definitive and final expression in the Christ gift as an unconditioned gift. And one last thing, again, since we really didn't need to present on this one, this last thing that Barclay really just hits, I just loved it so much. He talks about how Paul says that if righteousness were by the law, then Christ died in vain. And so Barclay he says, God's unconditioned gift in Christ builds on no system of human worth and matches no differential ethnic distinctions. But my favorite is here on this slide. To require Gentiles to Judaize by taking on Jewish law practices is not simply inadequate and unnecessary. It is to flout the gift given by God, the new creation that alone is competent to grant forgiveness, freedom, life, and a righteousness that counts before God. So he's like, if this is what we're saying, then what the heck did Christ die for? All right. So moving on to Barclay's chapter, the practice of grace. We really think the whole point of this is to say that grace is this crazy gift given freely. However, there are hella expectations. And I hope y'all are okay that I said hella. All right. So in Barclay's chapter, he breaks it down into 3 sections. The first being gifts in the body. And what Barclay points out is that, Paul expects the grace of God in Christ to kind of flow through the life of these communities, such that the grace received is passed forward by believers and shared among them. So the return gift to God is also at the same time the forward transfer of this grace. Barclay points out that the gifts in the body are these skills, capacities, and services that bind the community together. Skills and services that foster many kinds of, communal activity, supporting and developing the community in its relations, but pointed back to Christ. So these gifts are given not for the individual enjoyment, but for the benefit of all, the whole community. The gifts of the Spirit are distributed around the body to individual members so that no member and no gift may be regarded as supreme or self-sufficient. As we do, we give, we rate things, right? And so Paul wanted to make sure that's not what this is about. No gifts can be omitted or belittled or claimed unnecessary. And so as gifts circulate, everyone is constantly in the process of both giving and receiving. The second section of Barclay's article was the reciprocal or the shared support. So everyone is sometimes, or in some respects, a receiver as well as a giver. And Paul is careful to insist that in this delicate relationship between weak and strong, they are to build up one another. The weak also have something to consider. Something to contribute. And so this one another piece was really powerful. Barclay says believers are to greet one another. They are to welcome one another. They are expected to encourage one another, warn or instruct one another. And above all, they are urged to love one another. Like it's this reciprocal things. And none of these gifts are of their own. There is no ownership. These gifts are derived from grace and given onward as a means of participation in the gift of God. Okay. The final section is the collection gift for Jerusalem. So a little background is that for the second time, Paul has organized a collection among the assemblies, gathering money that he would then take to Jerusalem. But this time he had a little bit of anxiety over the acceptance of the symbolic financial gesture. And so during this time, he draws out in detail explaining the relationship between the Christ gift and the practice of generosity. Barclay states that, human gift giving is a form of participation in grace. And then this here, divine grace flows through believers and is expressed in their giving to others. And then from God and Christ through and among believers and back to God, like this cycle. Our gift, we share it with others. It is a gift from Christ in the first place. So in our sharing it with others, God is then glorified and so on and so on and so forth. So I am going to pass the baton over to Michael.
And I'm going to talk to you about our strengths and weaknesses that we found in the article. Number one, Randy touched on this. Grace is free, but there is an expectation of return. I love what the article said. He said, grace is free, but it doesn't mean there's no hope for a response. No strings attached. There is some accountability that we have as believers, even though grace is free. And then secondly, another strength was it requires all believers to use their gifts for the benefit of each other. Brandy really broke that down, I believe, but we're to use our gifts with this attitude of just self-giving, where we just want to share what we have with each other. So other believers will be built up and encouraged. And then it emphasizes the believers are under grace. We've heard that for a long time, but I love this article because it clarifies the responsibility that believers have under grace. This grace that takes place when we come to Christ, it's a new source of life. It's a new way of living. And the article encourages us that this grace is to be passed on. We should pass it on. We shouldn't keep it to ourselves. And then next, it encourages interaction with one another in Christ. Brandy broke that down greatly. This grace, as we give, when we think about giving, God initiates us to give, and the recipients then are thankful for what they have received, and God's grace just flows through this interaction. And then the last point, at some point, all of us are believers. All of us are givers or receivers. And Brandy also broke that down. And Paul talked about this mutual giving. He wanted to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to give. And he broke that down really great. That when he proposed this mutual giving, so everyone would experience satisfaction when it comes in terms of giving. And then one of the weaknesses, the only weaknesses that we found, and when we think about it, how we always heard grace is free and we can't add anything to it, but this new development we have in this article about the expectation, this could be viewed as works, could be viewed as, you adding something to grace, an additional layer, so to speak. But it could be viewed that way, but on the other hand, it shouldn't be. because I think that everything in the article was accurate. And then we'll just move on to some pastoral theological implications. It's important for the entire body to discover and use their gifts. We learned how we need each other. And so it's important that the entire body are using their gifts fully, so everyone, no one will be left out, and everyone will be built up and encouraged. Then secondly, this article challenges us to love everyone. No one is dispensable. He challenges us that we should be committed to love everyone, regardless of ethnicity, status, or gender. And then finally, I'm gonna close out with this. We are to be faithful in our giving, and as we are faithful, we can be sure God's resources are never ending. He will replenish what we have given, and Paul he clarified that creation was a divine gift. Creation was a divine gift, and we've experienced, we've been the recipients of God's goodness and His fruits and gifts that have been bestowed on us. And we are not to hoard those gifts. We are not to keep them to ourselves. We are not to take advantage of other people as we even hold on to these gifts. But God has called us to use these gifts, to share them, and to share them with all who are a part of our community and life. And as we do that, brothers and sisters, we can be sure that we can continue to live out the practice of grace. Now I'm gonna turn it over to Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So in the shorter article that we had, the Deliverdict article by Peter Leithart, the basic thrust of what he's trying to get at is proposing a view of justification that's more than just how we typically articulate justification as a particular effect of the cross, but in fact is a name for combining the cross and resurrection together, and thinking about justification in those terms. And so just a couple of small changes that makes to our ideas of justification. One, it changes the ways in which we think of its meaning. So it takes it beyond just the sort of standard thought of declaring, an unrighteous person righteous, and now adds into it this idea of resurrection and a certain kind of trajectory of deliverance that comes along with it. And secondly, he talks about how it changes the referent. And so it changes it from just the specific work of the cross now to the event of the cross and resurrection together. And what that does is that makes it an event rather than just a one step in the salvation process, or what's called the Ordo Salutis, right? And so it gathers up into an organic whole, justification and sanctification, rather than making them separate units. And probably the most important thing to know about this is that fundamentally what he's talking about is the declaration of someone as justified being a speech act. And that meaning that in the same way that when God says something like, let there be light, like light appears. When God says something, he doesn't just declare it, it actually happens. So when God declares you righteous, it is not just a declaration of your righteousness, but it begins a trajectory of you becoming righteous in that moment. So it's not just something that is not just, or it's when he says something, it's not just true, it also becomes true. And so some of the strengths and weaknesses of this article, one is, again, it joins justification and sanctification into an organic whole. I feel like a lot of people are always trying to figure out how, if they're distinct units, we get from justification to sanctification, from being declared righteous to, and I'm also getting better and more experience of resurrection in my life. It's a pithy and memorable phrase. You've got to give it up for it. Deliverdict. This is a fully sort of mainstream and orthodox kind of proposal. There's not anything sort of funky or, maybe like what we would consider to be outside the boundaries of orthodox. He's working pretty much in the Reformed tradition, I think, is light art. And so it's a pretty mainstream or orthodox proposal. The footnote, by the way, bold move for Lightheart to write an article where the footnotes are longer than the actual piece. I respected that immensely. But he goes to great lengths to talk about how this is a very ecumenical kind of proposal, in that it also gathers up language that Roman Catholics and Lutherans and your garden variety evangelicals can all kind of get behind and agree on. It does maintain the forensic character of justification. So if you're somebody who really, really wants to hang on to the idea of Jesus or of God declaring you righteous, and that idea of a judicial declaration, this maintains it. And then one thing that didn't make it onto the slide that I think I thought of later is, and this might actually be its biggest strength, is that it maintains a certain kind of symmetry with the language of baptism. It's very interesting that when he talks about wanting to join cross and resurrection language into a new name for justification, how cross and resurrection mimic the kinds of the two sides of the baptism event. So buried with Christ, raised to new life. And I think there's quite a bit there that's very interesting, and is a really cool piece of symmetry for this proposal. Just a few weaknesses. One, the article's really short. Also, you deliver dicts. It probably needs some branding work. Let's just say that. A little bit of a question of, is this a distinction without really any kind of difference? It's a new name for this idea, but I feel like people are always trying to come up with proposals, different language for how to make justification and sanctification closer together rather than discrete units. Because of that, it's not entirely clear what's new here aside from the name. I know he goes into some depth about engaging with Gorman and some of the others, but it's not clear to me what's super new here. And also because of the shortness of the article, a lot here is more asserted than argued. So there's a little bit of a paucity of argumentation. But he does say he argues for it more deeply in other places. So it's more just a weakness of the article in particular. And briefly, some pastoral implications. One is that we can have a lot of security in what God not only has done in our lives, but also is doing now. So when God, under this proposal, when God declares you righteous, he begins a trajectory of new creation in your life. And so we can have a lot of security that God has not only declared you righteous in one sense when he justifies you, but didn't leave you alone there, is still walking alongside of you in transforming you, because the resurrection is at work in your heart. Another strength is that it is sort of event-based. This is actually a fairly, I feel like, really traditional, in one sense, sort of Lutheran way of thinking, in that, like Luther, Lightheart is pointing back towards the event of the cross for Luther, and here pointing back towards the event of the cross and resurrection as evidence of people having been justified. And so I think there's a certain level of pastoral help that comes from that for people who have, maybe tender consciences, or are worried about, is God actually up to something in my life? Is he actually transforming me? Is he actually changing my heart, et cetera, which leads into probably the third strength, which is that it does pair salvation with deliverance. Again, that when God saves you, it comes with the, not added bonus, but it comes with, what I'm trying to say, it comes with, as a package deal, this idea that he's also setting you free. He's delivering you from things that have you in bondage and that are preventing you from being, to use sort of the Snodgrass language, to being summoned towards the self that he has you in mind to become. And that's it.
All right, great. Good job. Okay, so for the sake of time, 3 touch points I want people to think about. I want to bring it back next week. So I think our presenters, you're not quite off the hook yet. We are going to dialogue with you a little bit more. But what I want to do is just simply say, okay, one, I'm going to challenge the presenters. So notice that when Barclay uses the word free, it's always in quotes. It's because he doesn't think grace is free. So he wants to call it a gift. Literally, the translation for charis is gift, and it's a gift with entailments. In other words, when we think of gift, we think, oh, I get the gift and I can run away with it. Who cares about the giver? I got what I want. That's a very Western way of understanding gift. But that's not how grace works in the New Testament. In the ancient world, gift was a way to initiate a relationship. Gift was a way to initiate the relationship. You cannot separate the gift from the giver. As soon as you accept the gift, you're in a relationship with the giver, and that has responsibilities. So that's why he wants to say that it's not so look at the wordplay here. So that's why grace is unconditioned, but not unconditional. All right, it's not unconditional. You can't, God says to me unconditionally, and I minimize the human response component, because as soon as I talk about, giving my life to the Lord, et cetera, it turns into something like works. And that's actually not what Paul's doing. The unconditioned element is that regardless of your conditions as a recipient, whether you're poor or rich, whether you're influential or non-influential, whether you're on the margins or the center, God doesn't condition who he gives the gift to basis on your social status, political status, or ethnic identity. It's unconditioned. But as soon as you receive the gift, you better believe that it's going to cost you your whole life. So I want people to really think about how, when Paul talks about the word free, he doesn't use the word free. Charis cannot be translated as free gift. It's a gift because we can't earn salvation, but it's not free. It costs us our whole life. That's what faith is. It's trusting God with everything. So the pastoral thing that I want people to think about is, let's remove the word free from our preaching. I can't tell you how much I just shudder every time I hear the word free grace. Grace is not free. That's the challenge of the text. I want people to be really careful about that. So I want you to look at the article. It's always in scare quotes. He doesn't use the word unconditional. He uses the word unconditioned. But I think that's I think our presenters did say that. But what I want to do is push the pastoral implications by the fact that Barclay doesn't believe in something free in the Western sense. We should really jettison the word free. We should never. I think it's a horrible cheapening, watering down of the gospel to say that grace is free in today's Western world. Let's eliminate it. And that's the challenge. And if you disagree, let's talk about it next week. And Drew brings up a very good point. So what is the implication of deliveredict? It is deliverance. What it does is it delivers us from one domain of existence, dominion of sin, into a new domain of existence, life with the Spirit. And in that new domain, the power of sin is suspended so we can live into what God wants us to be. And I'm glad the way you brought in the Snodgrass article. So, and that fits really well in what we call the union of Christ's model of justification. That is, are people hearing me? Are we okay? That is different from the imputation of Christ's righteousness. So we need the deliveredict tenant or component to break away from the imputation of Christ's righteousness idea, preserve the forensic language, but nevertheless talk about life as participation in Christ, not as a static status that involves no responsibility nor or radical transformation of self. So that's where I want to, so let's go back, and I want you to wrestle with this. Okay, here's my pastoral challenge. Stop using the word free. I almost want to say it's heresy, but heresy means there's no salvation in it at all. So I can't say that, only God knows. But if you keep cheapening the gospel and say it's free and people accept a cheap gospel, how cheap does it have to be when it's not salvation anymore? There's a real pastoral implication to that. And so we're going to come back and we are just going to fire on all pistons coming in our next module. With that, You're done. We're done, except for there's one group that wants to talk to me about the presentation group. It's kind of 2 weeks out. So, but I'm happy to talk about it now. So everyone exit and let me talk with the presentation group. So with the other, and then the other groups, I will talk with you, but we'll arrange something during the reading week because it's 2 weeks out. So, but this group wanted to do it now. So I think this was who's here? Let's see. I forgot who that emailed me. It was Julie. Yeah, Julie. So and you're doing
the constructing ethnic identity is the article.
Okay, yeah, and then that's group B. Okay, group B, and then we have the reading week. And then we have group B. So I was gonna actually contact A and B during, like, arrange a time to talk for like 15, 20 minutes during the reading week, but this is fine, this is great. So
well, I was gonna say, because Phyllis isn't here if you want to wait and do that. I read the
Okay, yeah, so you're actually 2 weeks out, not one.
Yeah, I was kind of unclear because we've got reading week, which is listed as the 19th through the 22nd. And then like our week is listed as the 28th through the 3rd, but there's a gap in there.
Let me see. Did I get the dates wrong?
Well,
I'm hearing some feedback. Okay, hold on. Let me let's
you know, it may be my, let me mute my other side because
28 through,
there you go, right there.
And then November 3rd, and then 18 through 22nd.
I wondered if that was reading week, and then the next week we were going to talk about Paul, and then the following week would be. Is that how it's going to work?
Yeah,
okay.
That's right. So what's happening is that we have the reading week, and then we have to commit a whole Tuesday to the Paul, the polite bribe, the Paul, the polite bribe discussion and your projects. You get the rest of the week to work on the projects, and then you come back. We have the ecclesiology section with groups A, B, C, A, B, and C. So all three of you are on that day. It's a packed module, but I wanted to give that room for people to be able to work on their projects and to have a class session to talk about it. So on the 23rd, okay, so if reading week is next week, on the 23rd when we meet, that's when we discuss the historical Paul project, and I give you we have it. We might probably won't need it the full 2 hours.
The 23rd is a Friday, so the 26th.
I'm sorry. I'm looking at November. No wonder I got confused. Okay, 20.
Well, don't get ahead of ourselves.
So 18th through 22nd. All right, and then the 29th is when it's due. The 20. Okay.
So the 26th would be Tuesday.
Yes. Okay. So no, that's right. Then you would have. I'm sorry. It says 28, but it should be 26. That's all it is.
Okay.
Does it make sense?
We're presenting on November 2nd. Is that when it is?
You're presenting on the 26th. You're right. You are presenting on the 26th.
That's not the day we're doing the Paul.
I'm sorry. I'm kind of a little bit distracted by the background noise, so I'm not quite sure exactly. I think it's because Mario, you're on twice. It's weird.
Oh, yeah, you are.
So my laptop let me exit out my laptop. Okay.
Okay.
Maybe that'll help.
Okay.
All right.
I think that's why there's feedback. Okay, that's much better. Okay. Okay, that's okay. Good. I was getting very confused. All right. Okay. All right.
So next Tuesday's the 19th, and we're doing, that's our week to work on the project, right?
Yeah. And then and then when we come back, there will be a time for me to briefly discuss. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to send out a video for people to watch. I think that's what I said. I'll send out a video for people to watch to help with the Historical Paul project. We can spend a beginning of the class period a little bit talking about your project. but it is the 26th. You are presenting the 26th. So it's good that, so I'm gonna have to talk with groups B and C during the reading week, but with you, I can talk right now, but it is the 26th that you're presenting. So sorry about that. So I know it says 28th, but it's the 26th. So it's just,
Okay.
it's just
I kind of was guessing it was November 2nd because that was the 28th through the 3rd. So
yeah, I don't know why it's a little bit off there, but it should be
okay.
the 20. Why is that? I think it's a 3rd because we have the recording. That's why. So if people listen to the 20, wait, okay, I see. The 28th. The 28th is wrong. It can't be the 28th.
28th is a Thursday, so that makes sense. A Thursday through a Wednesday. Sorry.
18th.
It's probably because the 19th through the 22nd is on a full week.
Yeah.
The 19th is Tuesday through Friday.
So let me just kind of, okay, let me 26 through the 2nd, the 4th through, I'm just going to count the weeks here so you don't run out of weeks. The 4th through 10th, 11 through 17, 18 through 24, 25 through December 1. And
Sorry,
then
Mario.
2nd through
I'm sorry.
8th. You know, it has to be the 26th. We lose a week if we don't make it the 26th. So I just counted it. So it is the 26th when you're presenting. So sorry about that. Yeah, there's a little bit.
So in the middle of working on our project, we're also going to need to present.
Yes, you are. You are going to, but that's still a lot better, I think, than trying to study for a quiz, for example, while you're working on your project. So it'll be, and you have the whole week off, so you won't be taking other classes while you're doing it. I hope, and you'll have other assignments that you're working on. So you do need to present on the 26th. If we lose a week, and we won't be able to finish the calendar if we don't do that. So sorry about the confusion. I'll clear it up. I'll send out a subsequent email just to make things clear for people. But it's the 26th is when you're presenting, and then you're reading Jeanette's Constructing Identity. That's just came out this year in 2021. It's a brand new book. You're reading a sample chapter plus the short conclusion. That's a reflection. What you're looking at is how Peter, so there's different metaphors describing the church. You have ecclesia, alternative word for assembly. You have the body of Christ. You have God's family. But what this person does is, I think, a really creative project, is that it defines what ancient ethnicity looked like in the world. And ancient ethnicity included family lineage. It included the myth or the story that describes the origin of the family and its legacy. She takes all the category. There's nine factors to ethnicity as we know it in the ancient world. And then she sees that what Peter does is he talks about God. So when it says that you are a chosen people, and I'm sorry, there is some really bad feedback. Is there any way to get rid of that? I can't talk over it.
I'll mute mine. I don't think it's coming from here, but I'll mute.
Okay. All right. Well, it might have been. I'm not quite sure what's happening with Julie's connection, but there's nothing there on your side. It did clear it up, so I'm not quite sure what happened. But okay. So when it comes to, so with the ethnicity part, rather than saying that we are a chosen people, so First Peter says, we are priesthood of all believers, a chosen people, a chosen race or elected race. Rather than change say race, she says it should be ethnicity, ethnos, and that Peter's using the metaphorically, analogically, that the church is in fact a new ethnicity with a new with a new genealogy. We're born again by the Spirit, and that new ethnicity unites Jew and Gentile together without erasing the cultural markers between them. So it's a really, so she's taking a potentially scandalous metaphor that Peter is using in this letter. He's trying to say to an ostracized Gentile group that you are in fact God's new Israel, God's new ethnicity. You're a part of God's new people with a family lineage, a legacy, an inheritance. She goes over all 9 factors what constitutes an ethnicity. She says that the church fits all of those, but and then she goes over pastorally in the conclusion, the danger that one does when you talk about the church being a new race. What you don't want is like fascist Germany and the idea that somehow you have a super race that is superior over all other people groups. You don't, there's a real danger to the rhetoric, and she addresses it in her conclusion, but she wants to take Peter on his own terms, and Peter is using the category of ethnicity, not modern ideas of race, to talk about the church as the new ethnicity, a new people of God. And so what you're going to do is you're going to talk to me about what ancient ethnicity is and what Jeanette Oak thinks Peter is doing to describe God's people or the church as a new ethnicity. And what are the pastoral implications? And what are the dangers? There's real dangers to that kind of language. So, but I certainly don't think it means being colorblind. I think it means being fully colored, and yet we consider ourselves beyond our ethnicity, one people of God. How does that look? There's a tension there. So that's the article. And I think Jeanette's a very clear writer. She's kind of a rising emerging scholar. She's a professor at New Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary. She's also a co-pastor for church. So she's very committed to the work of the ministry. She's very much interested in how we can have diversity and not destroy the diversity in order to have unity. She's committed to all those issues. So it's a great article, and I think you'll enjoy reading it and find it challenging. And please just help us to present on it. Tell me what ancient ethnicity is and how Peter uses that metaphor or image to describe God's people. What are the pastoral implications of the church being a new ethnicity? And what are also some of the dangers, the misappropriations we have to guard against? That's how I would tackle the article. So you have any questions or concerns? So you have your group, like all groups, you're group A. So this is your second presentation. No, you're group B. You're group B. So this is your second one. Yeah. So after this, you decide amongst yourselves, well, do we want to write our written paper individually or as a group? All 3 names get the same grade, or do we do it individually because maybe your work schedules are not compatible? It's going to be hard to work together. I'll leave that up to you. I'd also leave up to you which of the 2 that you want to do the paper on, which involves an extra research component. So I don't want you to write on both presentations. I want people to write on one, but you don't have to pick the same one. Maybe you divide up and say that we're going to do it individually, and maybe Mario wants to do the very first one you did, whereas Julie might want to do the one you're doing right now. I'm leaving maximum flexibility to you, but from after your second oral presentation, it's just one paper. So one paper individually or as a group, and you submit it to me by the due date, which is the last thing you submit. So really you can take the final exam, and then if you want to work on it right away and not worry about it later, you can work on it right away. If you want to worry about it after you take your final, you have time after the final to work on the paper. That's the last assessment, I think. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I take it back. I'm always confusing this with the Ignite group. The Ignite group could do that. Okay. So whatever's in the syllabus, please follow the syllabus. So I think in the syllabus, you turn in the paper first and then you take the final. So, and that's, whereas with the Ignite group, it's the reverse. they're gonna take the final first and then write the paper. But any questions, Mario, Julie, about the presentation? I think it's like, you're gonna have an exciting presentation. I think people are gonna be jumping about trying to talk about what they read. So it'll be good.
Are we still trying to keep within 10 minutes?
Well, people have
I've
not
noticed
been
it's
doing.
been going longer.
Yeah, it's going longer. So please try to aim between 12 and 15. I'm giving people a little bit of grace, but know that the people who've gone more than 20 minutes, no, they're going to get some docking off of points. I mean, that is a little bit too long. So not a lot. I mean, I'm trying not to do it because of length.
And at some point, will there be any additional credit assignments offered for those that didn't do well in a quiz? Because we were supposed to talk about the quiz at some point, because I just saw your message this week.
Yeah. What I don't offer extra credit because I honestly don't think I have time to grade extra credit. What I will do is, I think this class is going to be curved. So it's not going to be a straight percentage, and the curve will be at the advantage of all of you. In other words, the curve will bump you up, not take you down. So what I'll probably do is I'll zero in so the way curves work is you zero in on the lowest scoring group, and usually it's a group, and maybe that's the C's, and then you go from the next, and usually when everyone's grades add up at the end, you can actually see the groups, and then you can see people that are kind of in between the groups. Those are your A minuses or B pluses, or your C pluses or B minuses, the ones that are in between. And you have a definitive C, B, A, and a C, if you have too many of them, gets you on academic probation, but nevertheless, a C gives you full credit toward graduation and you pass the class. So I might do that. So generally, if you're participating, you're doing all the work, and I sense that the class could use a little bit of a boost. I do offer a curve, but I don't put in the syllabus in the beginning. I usually want to see how people are doing halfway. We're almost at the halfway mark, but we're not quite there yet. But I sense even now the class could probably be helped by a curve, so I'm likely going to do that.
Is there a way or a time that we can kind of go over? Not necessarily now, but I got to figure out where I'm not connected to the quiz. Even though you're going to do the curve, I need to figure that out because I need to understand.
Yeah, sure. So I love that. I love that you want to do that. So why don't you beam me a couple of times when you're available? We'll go on Zoom. I'll pull up your quiz. We'll walk through the ones you missed, and we'll talk through it. That way, I think the most important thing is not so much the points as much as if something's wrong and you don't understand why it's wrong, that's a red flag. So let's understand why it's wrong so that you can improve on the subsequent quizzes. So that's what we want to do. So we'll walk over all the questions that you missed on a given quiz, and then we'll talk through it. And then if it registers why this is the right answer and not something else that we chose, then we've done our job. I think you'll be in a better shape for the future quizzes.
Right. Great. Because the quiz one, I was just confident. I was like, yes.
Oh,
then I was like, no.
Okay. And then also know that while the quizzes are the newest thing you'll see, I mean, because this is the first time you're seeing questions like this, the final will feel like a rehearsal. So I'll often take the quiz questions and I might keep them exactly the same. I might change a true one to a false one, but a final exam will feel like a rehearsal, like you've seen these questions before, you work through them, but the quizzes are the freshest when you actually are introduced to these type of questions. So the final exam is meant to rehearse what you've already been tested on in the quizzes, and then probably the last module a little bit where we don't quite cover everything. I think you also get a chance to not write short essay responses, but longer ones, which will give people more credit. Usually people do better on the essays. So, and there's a lot of built-in factors, like the reading contract, you have to remember it's 100 points. Literally all you have to do is do the reading. And if you do 100% of the reading at 100 points, 90% of the reading, then 90 points. That's a big deal because in a 1,000-point scale, it's 10% that's contributing. So, doing all of the reading but that extra 100 points, if you do all of it, provides a really good buffer for the lack of ideal scores in your quizzes. So there's a lot of built-in safety nets in the course. The Historical Paul project, it shouldn't be hard. I'm giving you the resource materials. It's a questionnaire, not a full paper. You're walking through it, and it's based on a documentary movie that you watch. So that's another 100 points. I think a lot of people are going to get B's and A's on. So so there's built-in buffers, point values into the course to help the students succeed. Add to that a curve, and add to that also that if that the final exam is not going to be something completely brand new and unexpected, it's like a rehearsal. I think there's a lot of things going for you to help you succeed in the class. So Mario, let me know when you're available. We'll go on Zoom. I'll walk you through a quiz and we'll go over the answers.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sure. Anytime.
All right.
Anything else? Are we good? Then I'll let you go. Thank you very much. Thanks, Julie, because I think the calendar is confusing. I should remind people of what the calendar is, and that walking through it helped me clear it up. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Have a great evening.
Night.
Good night.